Hi, everyone. It is noon, so we will go ahead and get started. I'm sure a few people will be joining us along the way, but I will hand it off to Evelyn Nelson to get us started here.
Super. Well, it's great to see you back at Better Behavior Together. We're especially excited you're joining us on this super beautiful day. So we appreciate you taking time to join our Echo today. Just a few house cleaning items as we're getting rolling. Our program is supported by our Telehealth ROCKS grant. It's a federally funded grant that is extending both social determinants of health supports and behavioral supports to schools in Kansas. Just a few house cleaning notes. The session's being recorded and it'll be shared back with you afterwards. Your microphones have been muted, but we really do want you to unmute and use the chat to talk throughout. Also, it's a-okay to be eating lunch. We're really welcoming of that. And so please do, we're glad to see you on screen eating lunch too. Just a reminder, your certificates of attendance will be emailed to you after the session. It looks like everyone has typed in their name, so well done. That just helps us get both the recording and the certificates out to you. Just an overview of our wonderful presenters today. They're doing some tag team with the presentations. Dr. Melissa Maris is a clinical community psychologist who works with our team, really focused in on school mental health. Dr. Lenny Swales is a child psychologist at KU Medical Center, really sharing her expertise with PCIT and other areas. And then Dr. Alice Zhang is a licensed behavioral analyst, and really bringing that perspective and also a lot of experience working with children with autism and developmental disabilities. So welcome to our team. We're looking forward to the presentation today.
Melissa, do you want to start?
It is fantastic. Thanks all. And apologies. Hopefully the tornado siren is testing right now. So I was hoping that it would, and here it's going to come back around. So welcome everyone back to our Echo series. And thanks Evelyn for the introduction and handing this off. If we want to go to the next slide. In terms of project disclosures and also mitigating any potential bias, we don't have anything to disclose and we try really hard not to be biased. So we will be presenting the best that we have from the research and what we know from the research. And after this session, we will be sending, or Christy will be sending out the slides and the recording. And throughout the slides today, we'll be sharing some resources that are going to be linked to that presentation. We'll also be sharing those in the chat. So definitely please take a look at those and also reach out if you're trying to access something that we talk about today and you're not sure where to go. Please let us know. The goal here is to give you access to resources, and so if we can facilitate that in any way, we would love to make that happen. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so just big picture with our series overview. Last week we talked about disruptive behavior. So why do kids act out? Today we're going to be talking about anxiety and depression. Next week, ADHD, acting out behaviors, and then we're going to wrap up with autism and social engagement. So just to kind of get us started, really big picture, there's a lot of conversation about mental health, a lot more discussion than there used to be about anxiety and depression. And so I think it's just helpful to say that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what those words mean specifically, but also kind of big picture, just wanted to raise your all's awareness, if you weren't aware already, of this Mental Health America report. And so this is a national report that is done every year, and they go through and, like other groups, rank the states based on mental health. And so Mental Health America, so they do a youth ranking and an adult ranking, and the 2023 State of Mental Health report just came out maybe a few weeks ago. And so when you're looking at that, they do use a composite score, so they look at all sorts of different indicators to create those ranks. And in 2023, I am sad to report that Kansas did not fare well in those rankings and was actually 51st out of 51 for both youth and adult mental health. in terms of all of these different composite rankings. And so I think it's helpful as we're talking about kind of the weight and the burden of kind of this mental health issue to kind of understand what we're talking about. I know that this is your all's lived experience, and so you don't need to look at more data on it, but it is interesting to see kind of the different points that they're looking at for those rankings. One thing I like about this Mental Health America report as well, specifically for schools, is that it does put the youth rankings right next to the adult rankings. And so, of course, we always think about the adults who are involved in our students' lives, but also just remembering that there are a lot of adults who are involved in the school community. So adults like you all, your colleagues, other folks who are working in the schools. And so when we're talking about a lack of access for mental health supports, that ends up affecting everybody. And so that's certainly the case here. So if you go to the next slide, you can see here again those youth and adult rankings and where Kansas is landing in those pieces. There are historical kind of looking back over time and kind of to see those different pieces. And we'd be happy to talk about these stats in more detail at some point if that would be helpful. If we can go to the next one, Alice. So kind of diving in to focus more specifically on anxiety and depression, we thought it would be helpful just to kind of give a little bit more context around anxiety and depression. If you haven't kind of checked out Child Mind, I would definitely encourage you to go and take a look. So the Child Mind Institute is a free resource online, and they have a whole bunch of mental health related kinds of resource guides. What is linked here are the quick reference guides for anxiety and depression. But if you're looking for something quick and easy, maybe to hand to a parent or guardian or even a teacher who has questions, this is a good place to go. They take the same content and kind of dice it up in different ways for different audiences. But when we're talking about anxiety, of course, we're talking about extreme worry or unease. And I listed here some of the common symptoms for anxiety, and then depression, feeling very sad or hopeless. And again, some of the symptoms that are associated with depression for youth. And I organize these purposefully in this way because I think that one of the tricky things with anxiety and depression is that there often is a lot of overlap. And so what you see here is, trouble sleeping for anxiety, trouble sleeping or being tired or too much sleeping for depression. Kind of some of those physical aches and pains that might be associated with anxiety, particularly stomach aches, but also neck pain, just a lot of tension in the body. Same thing with depression, so low energy, weight fluctuations, eating too much or too little, so a lot of similarities there. And kind of on down the list. I do want to highlight here that one of the pieces about depression that we see in youth that is a little bit unique, perhaps, is this expression of irritability. And so I think typically we think of someone who is depressed as being very low energy and lethargic. And so we can absolutely see acting out kinds of behaviors from a young friend who is struggling with depression. And that irritability for youth with depression is kind of something to look out for in terms of a red flag with that. And so if we go to the next slide. So kind of putting this in context, so we started with a lot, right? So mental health rankings, Kansas isn't doing great and there's room for improvement. Anxiety and depression, there's a lot to look at, some overlapping symptoms. And so kind of taking a deep breath and kind of focusing on sort of what are some of the takeaways here. I think one thing to remember is that anxiety and depression, the way that we often use them in sentences informally, not talking about disorders, but, oh, this kid seems really anxious, or yeah, last Christmas I was really depressed. A lot of times we're using that in a frame that really is on a, kind of this continuum of ups and downs that everybody experiences all the time. And a lot of times a little bit of, feeling nervous or feeling sad. All of our feelings are okay, right? And we all have lots of different feelings all the time. And so some feeling sad and feeling nervous is absolutely healthy. And it might also be really normative. So there was a lot of discussion around this during the pandemic. And especially if we think back to very early on in the pandemic, it made a lot of sense that people were feeling anxious, right? Because the context around us was very anxiety inducing. We saw some really strange behaviors from folks. So thinking about the people who were hoarding toilet paper, like some things that were a little bit odd, but it made sense because the context was really odd. And so we want to be paying attention to what's going on around a young person before we really get too deep down into a whole of diagnosis or thinking about disorders. Stress is healthy, a normal amount of stress. There's also a lot of co-occurrence and lookalikes. So there's a lot of overlap between anxiety, depression, PTSD, ADHD. So once we start going into the diagnostic world, we start to see a lot of overlap. It's difficult often to come to a diagnosis for young children, especially, but also with adolescents. And so you start seeing a lot of overlap. I often get a lot of questions when I kind of try to level the playing field here and talk about how we all have some level of fear or sadness at some point. Well, then at what point does it become a problem? And so what we're really looking for when we're kind of trying to figure out, is this something that would cross over into a mental health disorder, right? Or something kind of on that other line. We're really looking at it interfering in functioning, right? And so we're looking at frequency, intensity, and duration. So frequency, once we've defined that behavior, how often does it happen? Intensity, so how big is that behavior? And so thinking about getting out of a chair during class, that's not a very big behavior. It's not very intense. Threatening to die by suicide or making an attempt is a very big behavior. And so one time is too much, right? And then also duration, so how long it lasts. And that's really when we are starting to look at healthy and normative versus when are we really kind of talking about a challenge that we need to kind of develop a whole set of resources to respond to. That's really kind of what we're looking at on that continuum. And again, I would just invite us to remember that we need to make sure that we are choosing our words carefully. There's a lot of benefit to talking more about mental health and mental health problems, to talk about our feelings, but anxiety and depression are and can be disorders, right? And they can have extreme interference in functioning. And so we just want to be careful that if I'm saying I'm really anxious and all of a sudden anxiety is a disorder, that we're just being aware of some of those words. We throw these things around a lot, and I think in some ways there's a benefit to that, but these are real and significant kinds of issues that often interfere significantly with young friends functioning. So just wanted to add that in there. And with that, I think I'm handing this over to Alice.
Just realized that I was muted. Thank you, Melissa. So want to talk a little bit about, we were talking about the basics about from last session. And we also have questions about what are the basics from the audience. And when we talk about the basics, we're really talking about the basic functions of behavior, how behavior works, and the principles related to reinforcement most of the time, but definitely punishment and extinction as well. So I totally understand that there's other parts of how depression and anxiety, how that can be influenced by physiological factors, how that changes your chemicals in your brain and how that impacts the person's behavior. But just from a behavioral perspective, acknowledging the other parts of how factors that can impact depression, anxiety, we are talking about those basic behavioral functions still work here, still apply here. So for example, there's the reinforcement deprivation model where we talk about maybe the depression is because that there is reinforcement loss. So for example, a lot of times depression tends to happen with adults when there's a loss of job, divorce, or loss of other important things in your life. That tends to be the occasion that may trigger a lot of the reactions, including depression. Also, another theory that can explain some of the depression is racial strain. I know this sounds a little bit technical, but basically just means reduced reinforcement. So if you have increased more and more expectation on you to reach the goal or being rewarded by what you do, that sometimes is really, really, really struggling and can be really exhausting. And as teachers, educators, we all know in the context of pandemic, we were throwing in a lot of responsibilities that we were not even know how to do that. For example, you're now trained to do teaching online, but you just have to do that, right? Or you also have now been taught how to support children in an online environment with their mental health and other parts of their life, but you just kind of have to learn and do it. So those type of things really creates a lot of burnouts, and sometimes can induce those depressive and anxiety related behaviors. And another part is about reinforcement erosion. So basically it means that sometimes the things that is exciting and reinforcing to us, as we have more contact with them, they start becoming satiated. They start becoming less reinforcing and less exciting. And a lot of times, I'm sure there are a lot of people changing their jobs, and because their job is not exciting to them anymore. That's part of reinforcement erosion as well. And another really big piece about the reinforcement deprivation model is about skill deficits. So when we talk about skill deficits, we're talking about mostly the lack of coping skills, or the lack of being able to use the skills to recruit social reinforcement. So that's something that is really not, even for people who have a lot of good skills, when depression impacts them, a lot of times they would also find it harder to find things enjoyable and being able to recruit those social reinforcers. But again, especially with the kids, a lot of the times, I think they are still learning. They are learning to how to regulate their emotions. They are learning to how to talk to people, how to have fun with their peers. So that coping skills and emotional regulation skills that can support them when they experience depression and anxiety is super important. And making sure that they have those skills that can buffer and that can help them to learn the replacement skills to be able to get the reward that can help them. Another part of the behavioral perspective is that, with depression, is that simply that there's too much punishment, right? So they may have had aversive experiences, and similar to, like, for example, sometimes the work environment is really, really hard, and some people just get really, really feeling that they are being cornered. The environment is not good. They don't really have other options, or they feel like they don't have other options. Then that can help. That can sometimes make the mood change and even develop into depression. And especially with when you are experiencing a lot of those aversive experiences, and especially from like a very young age, if the child is experiencing abusive environment and have not had the positive reinforcement and experiencing too much punishment, a lot of times they can be learned helpless. We all know this concept a lot about learned helpless. And there's tons of research to show once people are showing learned helpless, even when they're having a hard time to see things that other people who have not had that experience to see the perspectives, it's like they are in a tunnel vision in some way. So so that's about punishment. Another part that's related to depression is about positive reinforcement. So how positive reinforcement can play a role also in some behaviors that in depression, that seems to be a little bit counterintuitive. But the fact is that there's research to show that with depression, a lot of times, some of the behaviors that we tend to see, like, for example, crying, complaining, trying to find other people to listen or to share, those social behaviors tend to be more reinforced by the social environment, the social community. So a lot of the times what happens is that it becomes really, really a struggle when people tend to give more attention to those behaviors, and they try to do their best to help people, but then they become burned out, and then it becomes a cycle that makes a little bit even harder or more punishing for the people who reach out for help. So a lot of times I think it's really, really important. It's very natural to have those moments of being sad and crying and wanting to help people, or wanting to ask people to listen to and to help. But at the same time, it's also really important to make sure there is certain worry time that you can, you can worry about things, but also there are times that you just have to put that in a box and then do other parts of your life. So I'm going to be a little bit quicker so that we have enough time. Another part about this is negative reinforcement, which is really easy to understand. So one of the example of depression is people tend to withdraw, and they tend to be not wanting to go to work and wanting to stay in bed and stay at home. So part of the rationale or the theory to explain that is to avoid or escape from contacting environments that can elicit aversive thoughts or feelings, which is very common when you find the interacting with certain people in the work environment or in the environment at all being a little bit toxic or maybe stressful. You want to avoid that. And another part of behavioral perspective is that establishing operation, which refers to what I talked about last time about motivating operation. So what about the history? I already kind of talked about it, but like childhood abuse and loss, all those type of things can make things, make certain stimuli environment more toxic or more aversive than people who do not have those experiences. And another part about behaviorism is that there are a lot of treatments are actually rooted in behaviorism. So for example, behavioral activation, which is something that Lenny will talk about a little bit later, is that it really focuses on how to contact positive reinforcement. And also cognitive behavioral therapy, there is a big component of behavioral components. And there's actually a lot of research that does like randomized control trial to compare CBT and behavioral activation. And they found that what they found is that behavioral activation is as effective as CBT, but less costly, which is really telling in many ways. And of course, another really important therapy is called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, and is also rooted in behavioralism as well. And then what about behavioral perspective about anxiety? So I'm sure that a lot of people are aware of the respondent conditioning or classic conditioning that we learned from the psychology history textbook about Pavlov, about how they can conditioning the fear and how that works with phobia related behavior. So that still, it can be part of the theory to explain anxiety, but also we all know that respondent conditioning or respondent behavior is behavior that most of the behavior that we know or we learned are operant conditioning. Those ABCs of behavior, the learned behavior that involves learning history and reinforcement and punishment history. So with this, one of the theory is the negative reinforcement, which is very similar to what we talked about with depression, is that a lot of the behavior we have is behavior linked to the prevention and removal of an aversive stimulus. We try to avoid putting us in a situation that is going to be aversive. And then there's a relatively new, but not really new, I think this theory has started from like the 60s. It's called derived relational responding or derived relational frame theory, which is also the basics for the ACT, the acceptance and commitment therapy. So it was trying to explain how anxiety works, to show that sometimes you do not have to directly contacting the stimuli that make you feeling anxious or fearful, but you can learn that from the relationship of one stimuli of another stimuli. So for example, if you are afraid of snake, you might be learning you might be associate that with snake, with a reptile, with a picture of a snake, a real snake. All those stimuli have some relationship with an actual snake. And somehow, when you have a phobia or fear or anxiety with that, anytime when you hear snake or you saw the word reptile or you saw a picture of snake, that can elicit that fear and anxious reactions as well. So those are just some behaviorism trying to explain depression and anxiety. And I'm going to turn that over to Lenny.
So I want to talk a little bit about what anxiety patterns might look like at school, and some things that adults can do to support kids in reducing their anxiety. So what we see is that a lot of times we have this cycle that occurs. So there's a scary situation, and then either what happens is the anxious person avoids it, or an adult might come in and rescue them, which then reinforces them not interacting with that scary thing. It might make them even feel better. And then in the future, they've learned, hey, avoidance or an adult coming and rescuing me is what I need in order to feel better. So I've got some examples on the next slide. So for example, let's say you have a kid who is put in a scary situation of talking in front of class. They feel this increase in anxiety when that demand is put on them. And because of that, they refuse. They say, I'm not talking in front of the class. Because they don't do it, what does their anxiety do? It goes down immediately, right? Because they don't have to face that talking in front of the class. And what have they learned? This accidentally got reinforced. So not talking in front of the class made them less anxious. And so that made me feel better. That's been reinforced now. You're going to see that behavior more in the future because they're going to avoid talking in front of the class next time. Next slide. So then same deal here, but this time I want to use the frame of what adults might accidentally do that could reinforce the anxiety. So this time, let's say it's a situation of talking to a new person. And for someone who's shy or anxious, that could increase your level of anxiety when you're being expected to talk to a new or unfamiliar person. What I've seen a lot of adults do is they then, so let's say I'm saying hi to a new kid. I say, hi, my name is Dr. Swales. What's your name? The kid's anxious, they're kind of hesitating, and then the adult swoops in. They say, oh, this is Alice. She's kind of shy. So what has that done? The adult has rescued the child from that anxiety-provoking situation. What does the child's anxiety do when their parent or adult speaks up for them? It immediately goes down. And then they've got reinforced this idea that the adult needed to talk for me. I can't do it. And they're going to avoid talking next time. Next slide. So we need to break this cycle. And one of the most effective ways to do treatment for anxiety is to do this idea of exposure. Exposure is the idea of practice makes perfect and trying to provide the right level of challenge to reduce someone's anxiety. So what these slides show is some examples of fear ladders, where what you try to do is figure out what is the anxiety about. So the one on the left, it's about social situations with peers. And the one on the right, I think it's about separation anxiety. And then they work with the kid to try to organize and figure out, okay, related to this concept of separation from parent or talking to peers, what's the least scary version of that? And it sounds like for the kid on the left, it was making eye contact with 3 people. I like how concrete that is. And then kind of arranging it up to more and more challenging, saying hi to friends, asking a friend a question, etc. So the way exposure would work is after you've helped kind of dive into the details of what's the least and most scary version of this, you'd start practicing. So, okay, making eye contact with 3 people, we're going to practice that every day until it doesn't seem so scary. And then after that, we'll start practicing saying hi to friends. So it's about practicing this gradually. For example, talking in front of the class, maybe it's at first that they're, instead of standing up in front of the classroom, perhaps they're sitting down in their desk, but still having to face some version of that fear. Next slide. We also want to make sure when we're doing some of this anxiety practice that it's just the right level of difficulty. Just the same way of when we're providing academic learning, we want to provide just the right level of challenge in that zone of proximal development, right? And it's the same for anxiety too. If you ask someone to practice something on their exposure plan or their fear ladder that's too hard, that's called flooding, and we don't do that because nobody likes flooding. It's not a good idea. So here's my example of a time I accidentally flooded a kid. I was working with a child and I thought they might have OCD, but I wasn't really sure. And they had some things where they were eating food in unusual ways. They weren't using their hands, they were using their mouth. And they dropped a peanut on the floor while we were practicing together. And so I said, okay, pick up that peanut. Well, he picked up a chair and started to throw it at me. I didn't realize that I was flooding him, but it turned out I hit the button, which for him, it was germs. And that's why he wasn't using his hands, because he thought he had germs on his hands. And the idea of touching something that had fallen on the floor was way outside of his comfort zone. That's a really extreme example that you're unlikely to encounter. But the goal of when you know you're working with an anxious kid is how can I make them practice some version, some easy level of this thing that makes them feel anxious? The worst thing you can do is to make them give someone the opportunity to practice facing their fear. And then because they get too anxious, you let them out of it, right? Because that's allowing that escape and it's allowing them, they never get a chance to have that experience of the anxiety coming down. That's why you want to make sure you're providing just the right level of challenge and they have to face some version of that fear. So for that kid that was going to throw the chair at me over the peanut, instead, I asked him how he would feel if I touched the peanut, and he said, kind of scared, but okay. So I did it. So that way I showed he was still something that for him caused a level of fear and anxiety. So it wasn't letting him out of it entirely, but it wasn't flooding anymore. He no longer wanted to throw a chair at me. Next slide. So the question is, what can adults do when they're supporting kids as they're working through fear ladders? So the first and most important thing is praise that brave behavior. So whenever you see a child who is anxious and they face that fear, let's make sure we praise it and say, wow, that was really brave, or like, good job standing up in front of that class and talking. So make sure you're noticing and giving more attention to the brave behavior than you are giving to the anxious or avoidant behavior. We also want to reward coping behavior. So if you have a kid who's taking deep breaths to try to calm themselves down, we want to reward and praise that. Um, we can also encourage kids to use coping skills while they're in those anxiety provoking situations, like deep breath or mindfulness or helpful thoughts, which we'll talk more about in a minute. And then importantly, you need to manage your own anxiety. So making sure that the adults are also modeling anxiety and calm rather than constantly saying, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay? Which could then make them more anxious. Next slide. And then, it's all well and good to talk about kind of those really gradual, methodical fear ladders that I had before. But the other thing we can also think about is how do we live the exposure lifestyle? So, how do we find opportunities throughout the day in all experiences and for all kids in your classroom to approach what makes us nervous instead of avoiding it? So, I want you guys to think for yourselves, what opportunities could you see during the school day where someone could practice that exposure lifestyle, practice being brave? How might you see that at recess? How might you see that in class? When might you see that at school drop off? Even on holidays like Halloween. I had some really anxious kids from that too. And then, thinking about how can we make sure we're noticing and praising that brave behavior at those times. And then throughout the day, how do we model being calm? How do we praise behavior? How do we have a reward system for doing things that are uncomfortable? And then also making sure, like I said, more attention for brave behavior and less attention for anxious behavior. Next slide. There are some things that adults do that can make anxiety worse. So one of those is overprotection. So I think we've all seen times where a child might be kind of in this bubble, either from parents or also teachers, where we don't allow them to practice being in those anxiety-provoking situations, doesn't allow them to face their fears, and also suggests to them that it would be dangerous if adults weren't swooping in to protect them. The other thing we might do is accidentally model anxiety. Um, I think most adults don't realize when they're doing this, but even noticing for yourself, talking about your stressors in front of kids. Are you modeling being like, yeah, I'm stressed about being late for work. However, I know it's going to be okay. So, how do we kind of model talking about our own anxiety in front of children? And then, of course, allowing avoidance or escape from anxiety provoking situations. Next slide. Next, I'm going to talk about some strategies for depression. So Alice already alluded to the idea of behavioral activation, which is that there's this cycle that happens where we have a sad mood because of depression, and then low energy. And then because of that, we avoid doing things that take energy that might also be pleasurable. That leads to more social isolation, and then that leads to more sad mood, more low energy, more avoidance, etc. Right? There are things that we can do to activate your behavior. So the idea is it's almost like fake it till you make it, where you try to do these pleasurable things, the purple circle, and then also try to notice how is your mood before that and how is your mood after that. Um, so when you're working with kids, you might make a list of activities and help them see like what activities do you feel like help you, what make you smile, what activities do you find joy in, and then have them make a plan of okay, on Monday I'm going to do this, on Tuesday I'm going to do that, and have them rate their mood before and after. One activity I like to do with kids, young kids here in clinic, is I'll talk to them about this idea of like doing stuff that makes you feel happy and how that can help improve your mood. And then we each get to pick one thing we're going to do in session and rate our mood before and after. So the one I usually choose is running a lap around the clinic hallway. And it always makes kids laugh and smile. And then they usually make me do something totally absurd. Like I've walked like a penguin, I've wiggled on the floor like a worm, I've done all sorts of weird, goofy things. And then we use that as an opportunity to see, okay, what was your mood before we did that? What was it after? Oh, look how your action changed your mood. Now let's come up with a plan of going for a walk, getting exercise, inviting a friend over to play basketball. Some of those things that we know probably improve their mood in a less silly and more kind of long-standing way. Next slide. There's also an awful lot we can do with the power of positive thinking. A lot of times when someone's feeling anxious or depressed, they might be having thoughts that are unhelpful. They might feel true at the time, but they might make your mood worse. So for example, if you're running late and you're thinking to yourself, I left it till too late, that's going to make you feel more anxious. But if then you can change that into a helpful thought of, I'm going to make the best use of the time I have left. That could be a helpful thought. Um, Next slide. And there's a lot of kind of common, what we call cognitive distortions or ways that depression or anxiety muddies your vision. And you can talk with kids at a neutral time about some of the things that they might, some of the cognitive distortions they might have. So, for example, minimizing the good things and focusing instead and magnifying the negative things, kind of being black or white in your thinking, assuming you know exactly what negative or bad thing is going to happen. That's the fortune teller. And then the shoulds. So I should be better. I shouldn't act like this. Those kinds of things. Um, you can also point out your own cognitive distortions that you might have with humor. And then model for kids being like, oh my gosh, I was doing the shoulds again. Let's change that to a more helpful thought. It is important to do that at a time that's neutral so that kids don't feel like you're arguing with them about their thoughts. So maybe choosing a time they're not in the middle of having an outburst or a crying episode or something like that. Um, and then the last strategy is for kids who are constant worriers. It can be helpful if they're worrying all day long, to find a way to try to consolidate that to a shorter time during the day. And we call this worry time. So for a kid who's constantly worrying, we can tell them, okay, like your worries are important. We want to make sure we give time to that, but I don't want them to take over your day. So 3 o'clock is worry time. You can, if you're having a worry at another time of day, write it down, put it in your worry box, and we'll talk about it at worry time. And then at worry time, we're going to devote 15 minutes to talking through in as much detail as we need to what their worries are. But then worry time is over. We're going again to that strategy of, okay, write that down. That's something to talk about during worry time. And that way we're not having that worry or anxiety taking over the whole day. I will say that worry time is something that if someone gets to over focus on it, they're kind of obsessing about worry time, that would be a great example of a time where a kid needs to work in more targeted or individual therapy. Next slide. And Melissa, this is you.
It is. So we don't want to belabor this point, but did just want to talk just a second about kind of the practical strategies. So there are a lot of things, and Lenny and Alice both identified a lot of what we might consider universal strategies. So things that either can be implemented in the classroom with all young people, or strategies that can be used across a population, regardless of kind of symptomology. But it might be helpful, or I find it helpful, to kind of think through where we are when we're doing something either to prevent or to prevent a mental health issue or respond or to promote mental health. Are we in a place where we're thinking about accommodation or modification of a context? Those are very kind of special ed heavy sorts of words. Or are we in a place where we are trying to do treatment? And kind of knowing where we are on that continuum. And that a lot of times when we're talking about anxiety and depression, we're somewhere on that continuum, but we might be hopping around. And so thinking through that an accommodation or a modification is really something that we're doing in the school that is altering the context or the curriculum that's intended to increase access to schooling for an individual. So where that's oftentimes in a special education environment, a 504 and IEP is all around an accommodation or modification, which can be the same as treatment, but sometimes might not be the same as treatment. And sometimes what we find is that actually that accommodation, kind of the example Lenny was giving about doing the presentation, that if a young friend is really, really anxious, and then we provide an accommodation where they can present to a small group, we may actually be making things worse, right, for that symptom. And so just kind of thinking about where we are in that kind of continuum, and kind of what we're trying to do with our actions. Are we trying to accommodate? Are we trying to help everybody have access to that free and public education? Or are we actually trying to treat something and change that underlying issue, or address that skills deficit? But that again, in terms of practical strategies, that what is oftentimes going to be the best and most feasible approach is to focus on what is universally good for all students, regardless of anxiety or depression. This is one way to make sure that we get out of the way of treatment that might be happening in another context, or maybe even in our schools. But focusing on the things that everybody benefits from. Everybody benefits from a consistent and predictable environment. Our friends who are anxious and depressed benefit even more. And so having a consistent and predictable environment helps everyone. Thinking about ways to incorporate mindfulness or activity or exercise is good for everybody, including us, including all the grown-ups. And then challenging unhelpful thinking. And so when I hear sometimes the intrusive thoughts and ways that we can kind of coach around cognitive distortions, a lot of it is growth mindset, right? So when someone is kind of getting kind of bogged down in that stinking thinking that you're adding something to the end of it. So I can't do that yet. I can't do that without help. And so you're adding something onto the end of that. And that's something that we can just practice all the time. It's something that we can practice with other grown-ups, and that just generally helps across the entire board. So just wanted to kind of add that there. And also before we kind of do this final poll and then start transitioning, did want to highlight that for depression and anxiety, we should acknowledge that young people with depression and anxiety do have a greater or higher likelihood or a higher prevalence of thoughts of suicide, of acting on suicide, of attempting and then dying by suicide. And so we're not in any way trying to gloss over that reality. It is a reality. And so we just wanted to kind of underline that. We do have a number of resources if you are interested in learning more. We just actually wrapped up a Keeping Kids Safe series with Kansas Suicide Prevention Headquarters around suicide. And again, everything is free and accessible online. Please reach out if you can't find it, and we would love to share resources with you or talk further. We were not in any way trying to minimize that, but just wanted to highlight that those things absolutely are connected. So Lenny, I think I'm handing it back to you.
Okay, so now we have a poll that's about to pop up. And it's talking about what strategies do you see yourself using? So we talked about praising brave behavior. We talked about exposure, so practicing those situations that might make you feel anxious. We talked about exercise as an example of behavioral activation. We talked about talking through those cognitive distortions. And then we also talked about modeling. So, for example, modeling positive self-talk. What do you see yourself using? Susan, not fair. You want to pick all of the above. Oh, thank you, Susan. But commit to one. Commit to one you're going to use in the next week. All right, we have 75% of respondents, so I think we can go ahead and give it 5 more seconds. Now we're at 86. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So we had a nice spread. So it sounds like positive self-talk and praising the brave were the two most popular, but there was no clear winner.